Okay, I finally got my thoughts in order on this topic now. So I've been wanting to make this addendum for a while. On it really the thought occurred to me quite clearly when I was watching an interview with Douglas Murray. Some I can't remember the name of. I'll put it in maybe in the title of this recording or in the tags where he was being interviewed by someone. And during the course of the interview, he said, I couldn't believe how people in Britain essentially were xenophobic because of the overreaction to the people coming in on boats crossing the channel, and the overreaction in the country to this, because we actually take in much less numbers of immigrants than any other sort of European country or something like that, or our average is much lower than the other countries. And Douglas Murray's response to this was I think very measured and very reasonable, which is it is not really about the number; it's more about the principle that essentially you either have borders on your in your nation or you don't. You either have a legal system of immigration or you don't, and that is the principle of the matter. But also, I think he made a kind of a factual claim that you have to understand that Britain is the furthest country you can possibly get to in terms of entering the European Union. It's like the last, it's you have to go through a lot of other countries in order to be in a position to try to sort of physically enter Britain. But anyway, and it just got me thinking essentially how identity politics in general, and also things like critical race theory and things like that kind of ideological worldview, which I've described as being essentially a fascistic worldview in terms of a fascistic reduction and categorization and interpretation of how society should be thought of, and how it should be it has this really obtuse treatment of issues by reducing them into the cause of the identity being the overriding sort of measurement and oversimplification to work out how to ameliorate or adjudicate over what would otherwise be complicated issues. And um, and how easy it is to sort of to slander people with this ideological accusation that they're phobic, that their displeasure or whatever it is that they're communicating is not you know should just be reduced and summarized and aggregated into the idea that, oh well, they're fearful, and so they're just speaking from fear, from this kind of baseless fear that's disconnected from the actual arithmetic or the actual numbers or something like that. Um, that their sentiments have no articulation in any kind of reasoning that you have to actually contend with. You don't have to look at the reasoning. You don't actually have to answer it, because you can just basically slander it and label it as a phobia. And so if it's a phobia, it's you know the implicit the implication is that it's basically irrational, or it's stupid or something like that, or it's misled. Um, and so instead of actually having to positively contend with a particular sentiment or a particular reason, you instead essentially assert your own perspective as sort of holding the high ground, as sort of being the default orthodoxy, and anyone else who challenges that first has to sort of overcome a general accusation that's thrown at them that they are sort of part of this conspiracy theory of systemic oppression that they are sort of perpetuating and perpetrating via their irrational phobia. That essentially you put them on trial for the ideological crime of systemic oppression, and they have to get their story straight through that gauntlet, through that very particular specious ideological, kind of false dilemma in order for them to not have a phobia, never mind actually even starting to deal with what the actual structure of their sentiment actually is, what the reasoning behind what they're communicating is. So in some sense, you don't actually have to deal with them with any form of reasoning or integrity, because you've basically just slandered them as having a phobia. And so I would just like to caution that, when you are using this very ideologically infused language of, saying that people are phobic, that they're transphobic or homophobic or whatever, and that's just sort of, and that has come to mean so little now, because essentially, if you if you are doing something that normalizes something that is not specifically advocating and promoting or advancing the cause of fighting systemic oppression, then you are also being something phobic. It's like it's such a it, it's such a I mean, it's got this false dilemma woven right into the language. It's right there, essentially, to perpetrate this very coercive kind of manipulative. Um, and I want to also extend this concept quite further, because I think that liberalism, or and I don't mean like British political philosophy, British political liberalism, but I mean liberalism, or liberals rather, so-called liberals in from the kind of democratic American, kind of left, so-called left wing side of the spectrum, even left progressives, you know, I think have acclimatized themselves to this kind of what's almost a kind of psychological profile, and using this kind of this coercive, manipulative kind of sophistry and pseudo intellectualism, where essentially it's much easier essentially to obfuscate having to actually deal with other people's legitimate or authentic reasoning, their own genuine reasoning, when you can essentially just label them, and you can have to say, well, no, you have to defeat the label that I've placed on you before we can even have a discussion that includes positive reasoning. First, you have to, that they've sort of become addicted essentially to being able to shift the burden of proof, and to essentially entrench themselves as the default kind of moral authority. Um, and the level to which that they are willing to essentially traumatize and sort of go put people who offer any resistance to this claim of moral authority, that they really the level of it, of sort of psychological attrition, and the level of sort of sadistically edged, sort of treatment which is meted out in order to essentially help to perpetuate this style of pseudo intellectualism, which is essentially that, it's like a cultural hegemony. It's like, we uh, are going to guard jealously our presumption of sort of self-referencing sanctimony and self-righteousness. Um, uh, okay, there's a sort of a broader point to this, but I mean, the most troubling aspect of this is just how much of the left, so-called left, necessitates these kinds of sort of rhetorical sophistry in order just to sort of maintain themselves in sort of in keeping with their strange sort of narrative. It is more insidious than this, and I must say, I think that this infects people much more broadly. I mean, this infects Sam Harris. This infects I think Brett Weinstein also to some degree, perhaps to a less degree. I think Brett is a much more careful thinker, but I still think that there are sort of weird kind of sacred cows. I mean, in the way that he depends on this reductive notion of systemic oppression, and I don't think he quite understands the kind of the kind of the nescience which is sort of um, packaged in with the use of these very I mean, the problem with, like, let's say, theorizing about systemic oppression is that it's fundamentally a fudging intellectual maneuver, because there is nothing in a way in which you can conceptualize systemic oppression in which it can ever tell you to stop explaining things in terms of systemic oppression. It's kind of like wildfire. There's no way that it ever kind of um, stabilizes its own conception and gets it sort of concretized or crystallized well enough that it can actually be um, entreated into a kind of procedure that actually sort of finishes it. It's a kind of it's a narrative. It's a narrative. It's a kind of it's a total kind of metaphysic, um, and I mean, I think the simplest way that I have of debunking it is that essentially just look what it does to the concept of accountability and personal responsibility. It doesn't figure, it doesn't have a way of touching or making any kind of contact with those concepts. It's like it's an anathema to the notion of responsibility and individual accountability. And so you have to realize that you can use it maybe to do some kind of conceptual work, but to the extent to which that you're ever going to use that kind of theorizing about systemic oppression, that's ever going to have any kind of proactive force or any kind of, you know, you have to keep it far away from any kind of policy intervention. You have to keep it, you might be able to use it as an intermediate step in some other form of thinking, but it's never going to be represented in the final equation. You can use it in a sort of like an obtuse way. Oh, in some sense, I believe the only actual valid use in it, sort of intellectually, is that when you've got that kind of level of sloppy thinking, it's telling you that there's a lot of confusion over this topic, that uh, uh, there's a lot of sacred cows, that there's a lot of toxicity that's going on. It's almost like a kind of, it's an indicator that there's a lot of coercion and manipulation happening, and it's happening not in the way described by systemic oppression, because it's often that kind of aegis, that kind of umbrella that is basically uh, um, entrenching a lot of sort of bad actorship, as it were. Um, it's being used as a kind of as a cultural flagship to conceal a kind of the entrenched toxicities that have sort of these perverse incentives that are facilitated by that kind of convenient ideological narrative. Anyway, so there's all of those mechanics which are essentially given a free pass because of essentially dissolving the notion of accountability completely, to the extent to which that it cannot be figured into the narrative of systemic oppression. So it should already be suspect. It should be considered a suspect theory, in that, like, well, who's it good for? I mean, you can use it as some kind of vague historical approximation, and kind of like a nebulous generalization. But the idea that you're going to fix a problem by generalizing the problem and then creating a kind of a generalized picture of the problem, I mean, it's utterly pathetic. Uh, it's intellectually dishonest. Um, and it's interesting as well because it's such a weak sort of theoretical model that the only way that it kind of actually even justifies its own, or that it can the only way that it promotes itself or incentivizes essentially its adoption in new adherents or new prospective adherents to its cause is essentially by creating a kind of an envy based comparative measure that, well, other people don't have to go through this generalization. So, based on that kind of contradistinction, based on that contrast, then, all bets are off. The means justify the ends. We can do whatever we want until the generalization is vanquished, or something like that. Until the differential, which is a description that is a generalization, which means it might not even be particularly true in individual cases. And so, because people can complain about the generalization, they don't have to complain about specifics, and therefore the baby is lost in the bathwater. Uh, that's the sort of, anyway. That's a bit too much of a tangent, but let me go back into complaining about these so-called liberals or so-called left progressives. Um, so I think that to be really progressive, you have to not take the bait in these kinds of pseudo-intellectual, you sort of thumb-sucked simplification of problems, but it sort of invests one with this sense that one is attached or tethered to a movement which has a kind of moral authority. And I think that that is a kind of that is a drunkenness, or that is an intoxication which liberals are now too almost psychologically invested into. And I think the biggest problem that they have is that you can covertly um, almost strategically generate the conclusion that you want to generate from an exchange with someone if you can shift the burden of proof and you can force them to prove a negative before you even bother to contend with their positive reasoning. And you do that essentially by this kind of ideologically infused language that you call people phobic. That's the function of that language. Um, because and even if you don't understand that at a deep level and you start using that language and you think, yeah, no, let me ask myself the question about certain sections of the population, or about certain sections of people. Are these people phobic? Are they xenophobic? Are they, and just by asking yourself that question, you have already imported the whole ideological framework, essentially, and you have also imported this sense of moral supremacy, or moral superiority, um, which is hinged to this, to this kind of reductive narrative. And then you also sort of innately understand that you don't want to be on the wrong side of that game that can be essentially dispensed and deployed at will. Um, it's toxic intellectualism, essentially. I mean, I would again relate this to essentially borderline personality disorder, um, which I'm starting to refine my description of borderline personality disorder, or at least how it manifests ideologically in this hybridized, sort of form, is that what you're what is basically happening in terms of what these ideologues do to people is that they often don't state the false dilemma clearly, but implicit in their subjective perception and in the narrative that they are essentially broadcasting, and which they are essentially using as the wedge and the bulwark to move their agenda forward and to promote their agenda, is that they are describing um, implicitly in the situation which they subjectively feel is true, and so their feelings, their sort of their sanctimonious self-righteous feelings, their self-reported, sort of already sort of cherry-picked interpretation of reality according to these categories and things like that, have essentially structured within that the accusations that they make is this kind of imposition of essentially that you have to prove a negative, because if you don't even prove a negative, then you're trapped in this sort of strategically structured false dilemma. Now they won't say that it's a false dilemma, but essentially it'll be like, and white privilege is I'll just explain that, because that's something that a lot of people are should at least be somewhat familiar with, because they've probably heard someone screeching about it at some point. But so white privilege is essentially the false, packaged within the narrative of white privilege, the ideological narrative and description is the false dilemma that either white privilege is an insidious conspiracy theory against people of color, or it is proof that white people do have some innate power, that they do have some kind of innate superiority. So it's like, and that's hinged in their argument and their use of the complaint of white privilege. So that if white privilege is not being dismantled, you are either essentially you're either promoting systemic oppression and exploitation of people who aren't white, or you are in agreement with the fact that people who are white have better positions because they are like innately better, and therefore you don't believe in equality. So that's the false dilemma, which is basically packaged into the description and the complaint against white privilege. Is that, well, there are only two possible explanations for what is ideologically described and within the narrative and the categories that make up the worldview that understands something called white privilege. Is that those are the only two possible things, and therefore we must believe that it's an insidious conspiracy theory, because otherwise then we're negating racial equality. So that's the false sort of dilemma that's baked into it. And so basically, because of that false dilemma, they can compel people essentially to join them, because otherwise you are essentially a Nazi. You're actually promoting the alternative as the alternative horn in that dilemma, that white people are innately superior. So you have to understand that that is essentially where they get their escalating sort of accusation. That's how they derive it, is by essentially believing in that false dilemma. So and now they don't tell people what their false dilemma is. They keep that private. They keep it sort of covert. It's covertly projected onto people, and essentially it's extracted, or it's essentially used to impugn people's integrity, depending on how they relate to the narrative. So the narrative is unquestionable. The narrative is a kind of unilateral, dictatorial sort of holy writ, and it's just, and depending on how people sort of treat that narrative depends on which side of that dilemma they are basically, that they're indicating support for. And this is all coming from the ideologue. This is all coming from the worldview of the ideologue. They haven't demonstrated this. They haven't, they just believe it internally. It's a completely autistic sort of worldview, and even the on the level at which that this happens in terms of the false dilemma, it's a kind of it's a covert sort of manipulation. Um, and this is why they will essentially reframe your own language, and why they will essentially transcribe it into their fascistic worldview and into their weirdly, structured false dilemma, which they need in order to essentially have the idea of progress. Because essentially, with the false dilemma is also the engine of progress, in that they've got these two alternative, let's say, interpretations of their worldview, and they have to prove that their interpretation of the insidious conspiracy theory, that awareness of that is winning, that more people agree with that opinion, essentially. I mean, this is the worst thing, because essentially the ideological progress is just basically that everyone agrees in the narrative and interprets it the same way. But that doesn't actually change anything on the ground. That's how pathetic the whole worldview is that it sort of believes that you can change the world just by everyone thinking about it differently, but they also will think about it so differently that then they will allow any kind of ideological um, voice that sort of represents the high in the pecking order, in terms of the kind of this unitary, sort of bastion of conformity, and sort of and a kind of pristine overarching, kind of it really has this kind of fascistic totalitarian, kind of order. um, the idea that essentially that, well, if everyone just becomes a kind of pliable, if everyone just coos along, if everyone just kind of accepts the same yoke from the same ideological interpretation, then essentially there'll be so much ideological conformity that essentially um, problems will be identified in real time, and they will sort of be dissolved in real time, because essentially the ideological sort of um, mediation over it will sort of be seamless, because there'll be no cog out of order that will sort of you know grind against the grandiose, sort of overarching gears of the ideological ordering, um, or blueprint. I mean, so the problem is that these blueprints themselves, like, can't even be agreed on, because they are based on this weird sort of juxtaposition between the dilemma, between the wrong interpretation and the right interpretation of their worldview. And so, in some sense, the problem is that they can't dispense with their false dilemma, because that's the only way that they can even know that they're making progress, is they have to have a scapegoat to represent the other side, to represent the boogeyman, essentially. And essentially, what it comes to such a point where their ideology is such a farce that the only way that they can record that they've made any progress is by finding someone to play that role, and essentially to burn them, or to to sacrifice them, uh, because without seeing any kind of sacrifice, without or when perhaps without seeing any kind of retributivistic sort of bloodlust being taken out against the scapegoat, there is no sense that value has been ideologically extracted, because essentially that's this becomes the source of truth. Is if someone doesn't kneel, then there's nothing to prove the grandiose. If there's someone, there's no supplication. If there's no, and essentially supplication isn't good enough. It has to come at a cost. It has to come at a price. It has to come at some kind of damage. And so basically, the damage against the bad guy in the false dilemma is the only way that they can actually derive an idea that they have made progress. Essentially, you can't, because it doesn't have an independent reasoning within itself. It can only know that it's done something by essentially knowing that it has hurt something that it considers to be evil. So it has to, essentially, if it can't fight injustice, it doesn't have a definition of what justice is. And so that's how it's defined social justice, is the fight against injustice. And so it's all about the description of injustice, and it's about attributing injustice to particular targets, is the only way that it can actually even know that it's doing something at all. And so without that, and this is why it's prone to cannibalism. This is why it's prone to ideological cannibalism. This is why they eat their own. Because without the false dilemma, there is no can try and say things, but they'll probably come out badly. But it's like, this is a bad analogy. Oh, this is a bit of a mixed analogy, but because essentially their position has no independent momentum that's based on positive reasoning, they can only move from a tailwind. They need a tailwind to propel them forward, but their tailwind is literally their headwind. So the headwind in the sort of in that is provided to them in terms of their opposition, in terms of which is described within the false dilemma, or which is structured within the false dilemma. And so if they're not fighting the headwind, there is no tailwind to even, and in some sense also in some meta sense, they actually never go anywhere as well, because their headwind is their tailwind, and so they actually constantly, they never move. I mean, this is why they are reactionary. They are basically fascistic themselves. Identitarians are, they don't even have a different worldview. That's how they think of the world. But yeah, I mean, but you see, like this strategy is so psychologically compelling to a lot of people, because essentially there's nothing so self-satisfying as knowing that you can have a covert sense of expectation. You can have a subjective feeling of what you feel entitled to, and you can basically set it up. You can set other people up into delivering it for you, because you can just basically describe them as being your headwind, and as you react to them being your headwind, then that is the ideological tailwind that propels you forward, supposedly. And so essentially you're feeding off of the reaction and the resistance that you are basically inducing, and that you are basically also reframing reality to provide to you. And I mean, how this happens is that basically all you have to do is have some dishonest rhetoric and ideological, sort of semantic nonsense to basically just always shift the burden of proof, always beg your own question, always just compel other people to have to disprove your accusation and slander against them, which begs its own question, and which forms part of a narrative, and the conclusions of that narrative are the premises used in constructing that narrative. So and then you have a totalitarian worldview, which is what these people have. Okay, so that's everything that needed to be said about that, I guess. So yeah, I wanted to make this recording to specifically sort of get into the phobia sort of thing that I heard. I also want to add now another note, which is an interesting thing, because I think that the way to actually, this is slightly speculative, so I mean I might not have thought about all of this quite enough, but it's very hard. I mean I can do this in real time, so like I'm trying to work out a formula, a general formula of how to encourage people, and also to get people to try to teach people how to essentially defuse and to respond to these kinds of ideological poisonous, sort of narratives and things like that, especially when it's in the process of perpetrating its very sort of toxic tactics and things like that. And I'll tell you as well that this is slightly problematic to do, because when you're doing it, it'll always be potentially embarrassing, and in fact, there's almost an element of it in which you have to prove that you are the only way to sort of get them into dialogue with you, to the extent to which that you can actually reveal the underlying structure of intellectual dishonesty in what they are peddling, is to somewhat sort of provide the potential fresh meat that you're capable of being embarrassed, that you're capable, you have to sort of engineer a little bit of leeway, which can also be quite bad, because then the other person can just use it as an excuse to sort of just get into just endless diatribes or whatever. um, so it requires like a little bit of, because you have to invent an iota of good faith in order to sort of defuse their whole sort of mechanistic sort of machine of ideological, sort of regimenta- regimentation, rigidity, their ideological rigidity in their narrative. But anyway, um, so so take this with a pinch of salt. But I would say that another way to do it is perhaps not even necessarily. I mean, I was what I just said applies to when you're trying to have a dialogue, but there's something else that's a kind of like a something that's very close to a dialogue, which is almost kind of like when you're going to have a debate, where you're not trying to prove it to them, but you're trying to prove it to the audience. And that can actually be easier, because then in trying to prove it to the audience, you don't have to let the person that you're having the simulated dialogue with, or the debate with rather, you don't have to let the person that you're having in a debate, you don't have to bring them along with you every step of the way. And because you're addressing the audience more than you're addressing them, but you're addressing what they're saying, but you're telling it to the audience. And that also sometimes gives you a, a better way of objectifying what it is that they're doing, and that's actually a more stable way in which you don't have to perhaps go down the slightly potentially embarrassing route, but you still have to simulate something similar to that by sort of when you're expounding it, because you show that there is a wiggle room of interpretation, and you have to sort of exemplify the function of good faith, that basically, because essentially a single iota of good faith can, if well if clearly articulated, can completely diffuse their whole ideological system. But okay, let me get into some detail. So I think that what you would do, and perhaps not in this order, is you would identify the false dilemma that their rationale has baked within it. And what you would do perhaps is, and again, might not be the correct order of operation, but it's these will be somewhat the ingredients, and they might be better descriptions of how to do this at some point. But anyway, so you have to delineate what the false dilemma behind all their thinking is, and you have to basically name it. You have to call it out. And then what you should perhaps do is offer an alternative vision of how to solve the same problem that they are supposedly describing, but then also at the same time, or sorry, it's not an alternative vision of their problem. It's I guess like an alternative narrative of how to even address something that is similar to what they're describing, but you have to distinguish that your description is not the same as their description of what the problem is. So I would generally call that like an alternative vision. You have to provide an alternative vision, but that would also sort of involve a rebuke as to that when you're dealing with it according to your vision or the alternative vision, you can actually do things that are essentially unavailable to them because they are entrenched in essentially an oversimplification. And then that leads into the third element, which I would say is that sort of iterate the pros and cons of just to hammer home how essentially, well, in your alternative vision of how to conceive of the problem and how to drive a solution to it, you actually have these things that will be happening, uh, and you can mention pros which will actually, which would, you'll notice that in the pros and cons phase, that basically what you will be doing is you'll be blowing you, at that point you will have completely refuted their false dilemma, because and you will also show essentially, because it, like I should have said this earlier, but it's probably when I started explaining this, I started with name the false dilemma, but you would probably want to actually start by, I mean, it depends. Like, if you want to do it in a more sweet way, you would do the alternative vision first, and then you would name the false dilemma. Like, that's why I think that that order might, it might be better to give an alternative vision and then name the false dilemma and then go into the pros and cons. That might actually be a more sort of, but anyway, if you wanted to be more stark and sort of, you would start with the naming the false dilemma and then the alternative vision and then the pros and cons, which would then sort of solidify and tie everything together in terms of the false dilemma. Because essentially you would notice that you would be mentioning pros and cons which were hidden by their false dilemma, that the false dilemma was essentially obscuring all the positives that should be regarded as positive, but that they aren't regarded as positive because of how their worldview structures and hides this false dilemma to try to compel a very robotic kind of reaction to their disgusting worldview, which actually the cons of those worldviews is that the negatives attached to those to their strategy essentially is that they're not even effective. I mean, they're not even effective at all. But that like they basically measure retributivistic, kind of revenge as the goal essentially, which gets everyone nowhere in some sense. The idea is that essentially that you can take a token of a generalization and you can sort of scapegoat it, and that's going to get anyone anywhere. The idea that it's a zero sum game, it's sort of somewhat premised in this stuff, um, which is not how the economy works, but is essentially what is the sort of the logic that all of this stuff is sort of premised on. Is this weird kind of and then and everyone has heard, also yet further sort of weird kind of intellectual excuses for this. Well, oh no, it's the Gini coefficient must be regarded as a kind of as a holy writ. That is the overarching sort of guiding factor. That if we don't fix the Gini coefficient yesterday, then all bets are off, and we can justify anything. Never mind that it's actually in absolute terms it's going to make it a lot harder for us to develop. Never mind that it's going to make everything weaker and harder, and that we're going to, drive the fiscus into um, unsustainable levels of debt. Uh, and also never mind the disgusting sort of opportunities to the kind of the plutocracy to kind of leverage this weird form of racialized tokenism that is baked now into the law in its moral corruption and such, but creating a kind of ideological privilege as an excuse uh, uh, that's excused by the accusation of systemic oppression, and that ideological privilege is so badly constructed that essentially it can be used to further business deals with rich people with because somehow rich people are just as oppressed as anyone else so long as they tick certain boxes. It's absolutely crazy. It doesn't center around disadvantage. It doesn't center around the real problems. It dilutes political focus to the extent to which that anything can happen, because and you've basically duped a population into accepting this form of demagoguery as politics. I mean, identitarian politics is not democratic politics. I mean, and this is why we don't effectively have democracies anymore, because even if you want to say that people themselves don't buy into it wholeheartedly, when you don't have journalism that can actually tell people the truth about anything, because they have to pander to these identitarian categories, they have to pander to the sexism and racism, and this prejudice that's built into the canonical, sort of fascistic identitarian worldview that reduces society into generalizations of race and sex, um, and that the cause of the identity is the only real interest that people are essentially allowed to have, and that is allowed to be reported on by journalists. And you don't have a secular democratic politics anymore, because people's real interests no longer have anything to do with their 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 citizenry. It has to only to do with their identity faction. So I mean, people have already been transformed essentially in the in the gaze of journalism, in the filter of journalism. You don't get reporting on politics. You don't get reporting on democratic secular politics anymore, essentially. Um, or I mean, or let me be more accurate, because I mean, well, in some countries it actually is that bad. In some other countries, there are some lights that haven't been snuffed out yet, that haven't been throttled by this cultural hegemon, by this fascistic, sort of fad of identity politics. But at least then I would say, well, half the population does not engage in journalism, or does not touch, that basically half the population is basically somewhat fascistic. They believe in this stuff, in this identitarian um, intellectual mind virus, and the other half of the population is still wants to have a sort of a democratic politics, but they don't even have a democratic partisan competitor. It's hard to have democracy if you don't actually have political policy debate. And right now, the policy debate is basically between people who don't want to be fascist and people who are fascists, essentially. People who want fascist politics and people that still want democratic politics. But that's not enough, because that isn't an actual democratic dialectical process of choosing policy democratically. it's it's yeah. But I guess the worst thing about this is that we have been driven here by the lax morality of journalists. Journalists, I think, are almost, people used to complain about the lawyers. I don't think it actually is the lawyers. I think it's the journalists. that have done us in at least this time. Might as well be called propaganda artists. Again, I guess that's slightly unfair in some. I mean, the only person who I have in my mind as one of the lights that haven't is Tucker Carlson. Is that kind of and also the new media on YouTube, which until that gets uh, suppressed or shunted out. Anyway, I guess my diatribe. I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. Yeah, the pros and cons. I mean, it's interesting, when you start getting into those pros and cons, especially when you have, let's say, when you've uncovered the sacred cow of the false dilemma, then you really start to see the scope of reality that has been obscured and distorted by this weird sort of ideological reality tunnel. Anyway, I guess all these things are important.